Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, and glad to be joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the same Texas Politics Project. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, it is nice to see you here in the studio. It's almost beginning to feel like a normal thing again.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that summer just started, so it feels like a normal thing, but in the way that I like it.
And now we're going to take a break for 3 weeks, which we'll get back to.
Exactly.
But diving into it, last week we talked with our esteemed colleague and longtime collaborator, Darren Shaw, about the April UT Texas Politics Project poll. We went through a lot of results in that, but, with three of us, weighing in, we don't always cover a lot of ground per se, at least scope of the poll.
Some depth.
And the poll was a big one and had a lot of interesting stuff in it. We ran over a little bit, had a good chat. But there was a lot in that poll and a lot that we didn't talk about last week or go into in much depth. So I want to dive back into the poll, but with some current events pegs. And I think education is a good place to start. We had a few education items in that poll, but the ones we had, I think were pretty potent. And there are a couple of things immediately in the news that we can talk about. Let's start with the local elections that took place over this past weekend. One of the outcomes was wins by conservatives in some of the big exurban and rural districts in the state, particularly North Texas.
Right.
And there was a good Dallas Morning News story that you were quoted in that really did seem to reflect some of our polling results, but through the filter, as you pointed out in the story, of very low turnout localized elections.
Right, and in a part of the state that's really not terribly representative of really even many other parts in the state. I would say, if you think about kind of the political trajectory that we've been talking about in the suburbs in Texas, that sort of is the story of which is about sort of increasing Democratic competitiveness in these areas. But if we talk about what are like the suburbs that are sort of the Republican strongholds in the state, these are the counties that's, encircle Dallas, encircle Fort Worth. And these are really where the focus was on these school board elections, right?
Right. And these were North Texas counties that we're talking about.
Right. North Texas counties around Dallas and Fort Worth. And in particular, the reason that there was a lot of attention going into these races because essentially, a conservative business owner / activist or what have you basically pledged to contribute about $500,000 to the election of sort of a slate of conservative candidates up there across multiple school districts, actually. And then I think there was some reinforcing support from some other parts, but they had, basically professional campaign consultants. They were spending, let's say, tens of thousands of dollars in races where candidates usually raise, maybe $1,000 or a couple $1,000. And so, on the one hand, there's sort of two things going on here. On the one hand, I'd say there's definitely, something going on in education politics in the state and the way that attitudes towards education are being mobilized around the election, right? And then there's sort of, the results of these races and sort of, and the wins by, again, almost the entirety of the conservative slate. And, let's just say this right now, whenever we get these questions, whenever an election comes by about, what does this tell us about everything? I can't help but being like something of a survey statistician and say, well, how representative is the election of the people you say that it's, telling you something about, right? And in this case, we're talking about a Saturday election in May, right?
In very, you were calling them, they're suburban, but, also
exurban.
Kind of exurban districts. So these are relatively homogenous districts, and particularly that region that has been kind of ground zero for conservative politics in the state.
I think because of like my data perspective, sometimes I can be a little bit heavy-handed with my categorizations because I'll rely on the counties a little bit more than I should, especially with these school districts, which
Well, these counties are the counties where they are both suburban and exurban.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And I think people can kind of underestimate this too, especially when you're talking about school districts. I mean, Travis County, I know just for various reasons, I think has 5 or 6 different school districts in it where Austin is. So just as an example, this is, there's a lot of school districts in Texas. But the point is do these, sort of very low turnout, off-year elections, and then the other question is, is there a big resource, inequality here, right? And again, we had one side that was.
Or there's something distinctive about the resources that get. Yeah, right.
Right.
Or I see what you're saying. Balance between two sides.
Yeah. So you've got one side spending $500,000, and you've got the other side where maybe all of the candidates combined, in opposition, spent less than $100. I'm sure. So, needless to say, not terribly reflective of stuff. But then the question is, well, how else do we know it's not reflective? And part of it is we've asked all these questions, right? And so we've been asking questions about some of these sort of issues du jour around public education, in particular parental involvement, people's feelings about the teaching of race. I think
sexual identity.
Yeah, I would say more tangentially to this a little bit, sexuality and sexual identity, right? And what we find, and we found this, we've been doing this now because the education issue has increased in salience. I mean, we obviously regularly pull about education, but what we tend to find is, I would say in terms of the direction that Republicans are taking this debate, I would say we find, at best a certain amount of ambivalence, and at worst for the Republican sort of direction of this, probably, slight majority opposition in some of these spaces. But the main thing is a lot of this is really new, right?
Right.
And so, that's the other piece of this is, finding kind of the most activated, engaged voters on the one hand in a small election where you have a bunch of resources, not a heavy lift. The thing that I'm kind of looking ahead
in an electorate that favors your activism.
Yeah, and an electorate that favors your, well, and I should say this too. I mean, I think we've said this before, but I'll just go ahead and say it, which is, and also on an issue that the Democrats have been stymied by. I mean, our cluster of issues the Democrats have been stymied by, and there's not a counter message that's sort of been apparent. The Democrats have really mobilized in response to basically greater calls for parental involvement. They can't say, well, we think actually parents should have less say over their children. It's like,
and in fact, there's obviously the prominent example of, when people have said that out loud, like Terry McAuliffe.
Yeah.
They've really, they've taken a beating for it. And often, I would say, not substantively, but rhetorically kind of deserved it. I mean, that this is something you have to obviously approach with some care in your messaging.
Well, yeah, and I would say, and the other thing I would say is, what Democrats could say is they could say, hey, look, looking at our polling again, or anybody say, hey, look, Texans have consistently failed to rate the Texas public education system as a high quality system, right? You can look at how, our per pupil spending, you can look at a lot of different metrics. Generally, when people talk about the Texas education system, it's not to say, boy, this is a great public education system. Democrats could make the argument that,
in fact, we polled and what they say is it's pretty good.
Yeah.
It's good.
It's good enough. But the thing about Democrats, they could say, hey, look, after all of the COVID-related learning loss, the fact is, with all the inflation going on, these aren't the issues we should be talking about. Right. But the problem is even, I mean, this is just a basic kind of psychology, politics, messaging thing. But even this, you still have to acknowledge the arguments that they are making that you still don't have an answer for if you're Democrats.
Well, to continue on education for another beat or so, I mean, one of the things, we've talked about it on the podcast. Yeah. We've now polled on this a few times, I guess, right? Asking the parental involvement question, a variation of, the teaching racism in the classroom, et cetera, and whether parents should be involved in that. We've also, not directly related to this, but certainly have a piece, talked about one of the weaker points that that Republicans have launched on this, and that is the school library book monitoring. But I was trying to remember when it was. On the podcast a month or two ago, we talked a bit about, the theory that this was really the leading edge. Not that these issues in and of themselves don't generate political momentum within a certain political cohort, partisan ideologically, but also that this was also smoothing the way for a more traditional Republican and conservative issue in public education that has not always been overwhelmingly popular, but it's divided the electorate, and that is vouchers.
Right.
Right. And, a shoe dropped on this last night in that, Greg Abbott, speaking in San Antonio, promised to support full funding of public ed, but also added that they wanted to to paraphrase, they wanted to revisit vouchers.
Right.
And, the language quoted in the quorum report blast that first broke this last night. Empowering parents, this is a quote from Abbott, empowering parents means giving them the choice to send their children to any public school, charter school, or private school with state funding following the student. And that's why a minute ago, when you talked about kind of student empowerment, I was like, no, we've seen this language before. Right. It's just in a different kind of setting. And should also say that, this was really picked up with a lot of context and a good piece in the Houston Chronicle this morning. We're recording this on Tuesday. May have posted late last night, but I think it was this morning, by Edward McKinley. I would urge people to look at that because it does a good job of putting together the issues that we were talking about that are kind of on the table in these school board elections, but then putting together a larger package that includes and vouchers. And so I want to mention that in part is like, hey, told you so. But also I will say, I didn't think that they would necessarily pull the trigger on that this quickly. I thought they would let it simmer on the back burner with these other big issues, I shouldn't say big issues, with these other hot issues of parental involvement and, quote unquote CRT and books in libraries, and then use that to smooth the way within the context of the COVID stuff. And let this other shoe drop once the session started. I think they've probably done some polling. And look, the polling we just did show a little bit of movement on this. It's one of those things. Yeah. We wouldn't call it a trend. No. It was a result that followed a result from, I think, a few years ago, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Right. And so, but it is there.
Yeah. So, okay, so let me tell you what the result is. Let's get that out, and then I want to go back to your point because I think I agree with you, but it's I have a little bit of a different view on it.
Yeah,
it's probably consistent. But anyway, in our most recent poll, we don't talk about vouchers because vouchers is a loaded term. So that's basically
for a long time the voucher people now the voucher people don't use the term voucher.
Yeah, it's about
become a negative coding. Yeah,
right. It's a pro-choice position. So we ask about redirecting state tax revenue to help parents pay for some of the costs of sending their children to private or parochial schools. Now, we include some of the costs because in a lot of cases, the money that would follow a student is not going to cover the total cost, so we don't want to misrepresent that. The idea here is, Abbott only mentions private schools, but a big part of this is going to be parochial schools as well, for sure. So anyway, in the most recent poll, we found that plurality, 45% of Texans were supportive of redirecting the state tax revenue, 40% were opposed. Unsurprisingly, 59% of Democrats were opposed, but 25% were in support. Among Republicans, 61% supported, 27% opposed. The dynamic that kind of comes up most often when we talk about this in the legislature is the difference between urban, suburban, and rural voters. But here, we find less difference, I think, than we used to to some extent, although, they look pretty comparable. I mean, you have pluralities of both urban, suburban, and rural voters say they would support vouchers. Urban voters are almost even, 43 support, 41 oppose. Republicans are suburban similar, 45, 41. Rural a little more supportive, which kind of aligns with the partisanship that we're seeing that sort of has a geographic component. So 48 support, 35 oppose. So, it's not an issue you win an election on or you build a campaign on, obviously, right? Now, you were saying before, you were surprised that they moved so fast and that they didn't let these sort of other, cluster of issues simmer. And I think what's interesting is, one, how quickly they've taken this cluster of issues and sort of manifested it into a state level kind of policy responses, which I think is, and this is, again, I've said before, I think this is the best time to do it because I actually think you are going to find a number of Democrats who are going to say, yeah, go ahead. At the same time, just because, in a very natural, big picture sense, but in a localized sense. But the other thing I was thinking about with this is, people were saying, we were talking about this yesterday. Well, okay, so they've had all this success now, does this portend anything for November? And I said, I feel this way in a weird way, like I feel about the abortion issue in some sense. Now, you in the last podcast, used the dog catches car reference for the abortion reluctantly. Now
I've seen it everywhere.
Well, and I've seen a very conservative, very pro-life Republican state legislator use the same term about basically Republicans' position, having found this, having found themselves here. So now I feel like it's totally justified for anybody.
It was pretty fresh when we were talking about it last week, and it felt like maybe it was a little too soon.
No, but I think once you have,
it's just my sensitivity.
You're very sensitive. So now that you have, conservative Republican House members saying, yeah, we caught the car. It's like, okay, we can all acknowledge that. But I think, so in thinking about, the response going forward, I think part of this is saying, okay, well, now if the court is going to say, okay, states, it's up to you. Well, how the state responds becomes part of how we're going to have to incorporate the impact of that decision into the 2022 election. The thing about that, though, that's going to be a response that's driven at the state level with all of the resources that Abbott and Patrick can bring to bear on that, all of the message testing, all of the polling. The thing about local school board races is this is not necessarily the same quality or caliber of elected official as your statewide candidates, right? And so now you have a bunch of school boards who have been stocked with ideologues. And these are not ideological positions. These are really, nuts and bolts, like constituent.
They weren't.
Well, they weren't, but that's the point, though. These are nuts and bolts constituent-facing positions where it's pretty easy to mobilize, again, an angry slice of that electorate. But then the reality is that, if these school boards start going ahead and implementing, let's just say, who knows what in the advancement of sort of the things that they've ran on, that's going to happen in the fall.
Yeah.
And I would say that's possible that then you see a backlash in some of these communities if they go too far, too fast on a lot of these issues where, one, people are still trying to figure it out, but also whereas, at the state level, when you talk about the manifestation of this into sort of a school voucher, school choice, whatever discussion, that's a discussion I think that, again, we knew we were heading towards.
Yeah.
We knew that there was, again, a desire to do that among the leadership, and they're prepared to have that discussion. What goes on in these school boards in these competitive suburbs now that you've basically stocked it with these people, that's a big open question.
Could become a new factor.
So that's why I would say, I agree with you, but on the one hand, I almost go on a different side. Like, I think it's actually a way to take control of the discussion a little bit before it gets out of hand. But, just a theory.
I wonder.
Yeah, well, sure. The flip side of that, I'll just say, another way that it kind of relates to, well, anyway, no, let's leave it there.
Well, I'm sitting here pondering that. They may have just thought that it was better to do this all along, and I was just wrong.
Yeah.
But the other thing I do want to touch on that is that we were talking about before we started recording is the interesting sort of the tension between what I'm going to call the rural kind of elite, traditional rural elite position on vouchers,
right?
Which has been to be dead set against it,
right?
And it's part of the lore of the legislature that one of the reasons that you can never pass a voucher bill, no matter how much energy there is among some fairly powerful interest groups within the Republican Party, is that it can't get past the interests of the rural legislators' interpretation of their interests, particularly in the House.
Right, in both parties.
In both parties, but there aren't any real Democrats left. So,
historically, I've seen the historical lore,
but historically, yeah. And so, it's an interesting in terms of other broader issues that we're talking about, that among voters, is this yet another instance of a growing tension between what some elites in the Republican Party want and what rural voters are responding to in terms of ideological cueing and, their application of these, very powerful cues about CRT and education. Because, I would argue that in a lot of ways, certainly if you're a parent and you're an activist parent, this may very well feel like a matter of direct interest in terms of what your child is being taught in school. But we also know that there is a lot of older Republicans, presumably with kids that don't have kids in school anymore, that are responding from a different ideological or political perspective and context here. And I'm wondering, we go through this all the time. We don't, the kind of with kids, without kids thing doesn't really work very well given our data set. And we've often seen that there isn't that much difference.
I was going to say,
but on this, I wonder if there is.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know. But there's something interesting going on there in terms of the fact that, the polling on this issue, on the times that we've asked, has generally, at the voter level, not matched what you hear from inside the legislature and inside the political arena.
Yeah.
About why you can't get vouchers to now. It's traditionally been kind of an alliance between rural Republicans and urban Democrats.
Yeah.
But you've also seen some very high level urban Democratic defections. They're still apostate people, and there are a lot of reasons that one can derive this. I'm thinking of, Harold Dutton in Houston.
Yeah.
for example. Now, again, Harold is kind of, in many ways, a bit of an outlier in the Democratic caucus, or Representative Dutton, but nonetheless.
That's why he has had the position he had on education.
Right. But it does, again, I don't want to, do what we always tell people not to do, which is overinterpret this result. But I think it's fair to wonder, and you kind of, alluded to this in passing, just how much the experience of the pandemic shifted some of the attitudinal terrain, particularly among people with kids in schools, when it comes to public ed. And we've talked about that a little bit, maybe not on the podcast.
Yeah. No, I mean, the flip side, I've been doing it in a half jokey negative sense from the potential for democratic openness to basically, probably certain Republican parents in their districts, taking their kids elsewhere. At the same time, though, we've just gone through this humongous disruption where, a bunch of what you would think of as urban Democrats might not be living in urban areas anymore, or the people who move to Texas aren't necessarily moving to city center, and the idea of more flexibility with education dollars might, sound attractive. But,
people had an experience with more flexibility in making education. I mean, at some basic literal level, a lot of people have now more experience in thinking about their kids' learning as more than, I get my kid up in the morning, I pack them up, I send them to school.
Right.
They come home. They have to do a bunch of homework. I help them with it. I don't help them with it. They do it on a computer, a pad, books, whatever. But, that model, a lot of different things have happened in the last few years.
Right. And so it's interesting. There's so many interesting things here based on what you just said in this discussion, that the cross currents are kind of amazing when thinking about the previous discussions that have gone on about this, right? So on the one hand, you think prior discussions, I can picture Dan Patrick talking about how, the rich parents just already have school choice. And it's, this is for the non-white kids and the poor kids and, in Texas, almost really talking to it's a way to kind of create a wedge in the Democratic coalition. Right. But in some ways, it's almost like you'd say, it's actually the sort of well-off, college-educated, remote working pair of tech Democrats now, right? Who say hey, maybe you want your kids to have the same kind of educational flexibility that you have with your work, or whatever. Right. There's just sort of the different things. The other side of it that I also think is kind of a weird kind of cross currents is, you mentioned in thinking about where Republicans were on the immigration issue, on this sort of cluster of sort of really, I would just cluster it, describe it as culture war-like sets of education issues in the school. In some ways, it's interesting because you've gone from a set of issues that, I think the boundaries are a little bit sharper and potentially a little bit more dangerous if you go too far, potentially.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when you're talking about it, you've got all the energy in the world, which is part of what these election results are about, right? You can talk about, the future, the nature of the nation's future and children's souls and their education, right? And in some ways, you're almost saying and not to say that they're not still going to take on these issues, we're not going to have further, CRT bills or whatever in the legislature next session, but by shifting the education lift to a voucher program, which would be a heavy lift, I think, in some ways, you're almost neutering a lot of that argument. You're saying, well, and not that you can't do both, but in some ways, children's futures are important, but what if we just give them the chance to go somewhere else?
Yeah, which is also, that's the soft sell, but I think we're past the moment of the soft sell.
Yeah.
That's another interesting aspect of this, right? I think it's going to be hard to put it this way. I think it's going to be hard to turn the spigot off on CRT and, quote unquote CRT and, greedy teacher unions and,
right.
And it's I guess the interesting thing to watch will be how salient will the kind of ideologically charged frame that Republicans have put on the public education issue through discussion of critical race theory and curriculum and parental choice and all this. Yeah, will that make the issue more salient for voters that are voting not on the substance of public education, but on those issues? And when I see that voucher result, again, I don't want to overinterpret it, but it does make me think that, if you make this issue more salient and more of a test of party republicanism and conservative bona fides for your older activist, ideologically driven conservative Republican voter at the same time that you have people that were more, for various kinds of reasons, more likely to reject out of hand the notion of vouchers, and for similar reasons, right? I mean, partisan framing of that on the Democratic side is also a real thing. Between those two things has the ground shifted? And I don't know, but I suspect that, my interpretation would be not so much, per your earlier kind of speculation. I know you're not putting this in the bank, but I think it's more likely that Team Abbott and the statewide officials see the opportunity now and feel like they have softened the ground rather than wanting to move away from the other stuff. They seem pretty comfortable with the more ideological arguments. I think they probably see them as pretty as part of a successful strategy. And I suspect that there are advisors and entrepreneurs that have been pushing this that are encouraging that interpretation, inside.
Yeah, I think look, we should wrap this up soon. I think the difficulty that they face with that, look, there's a lot of advantages to it, which one, you're the majority party in the state and you turn out more voters than the other side regularly. So full stop.
Yeah.
Right. I think, what's interesting in this moment is, and I still, there's a lot of ways in which, sort of the way with the abortion movement and then the sort of aggressive move potentially in the education space, I think you do lay the ground for a potential backlash when you're playing in a space where it seems like in most instances, either, you're breaking even with voters on the issue or a plurality or slight majority kind of oppose the area that you're working in.
Yeah.
And so, it may activate, the majority of the majority party voters. But, I think once you start, we always say this, once you start getting into schools and start messing with kids and, you're activating a large constituency of people who probably weren't going to show up on May 7th for like a random school board race in Carrollton. But if the school boards, in a couple places or even multiple places start, going,
beyond the pale
in some, which again has kind of already happened in some instances, right? Then you're activating the everybody else. Right. And, again, we've seen this happen before. It doesn't mean that Republicans lose the election, but it could make, for a closer haircut.
Right. It's easy to underestimate counter-mobilization. When you look at your own mobilization and it seems successful and you're feeling it, I think there is sometimes a tendency to miss that there's a counter-mobilization potential in what you're doing. And
what I'd say is, and as much, research and resources as the, Abbott and Patrick and all of them have to look at this stuff, most often from what I've seen, from what they release and what they show, they're testing messages, and they're testing, and their primary focus is how that message lands among their voters. Yeah. And so that's where I say, they may go hey, we're happy doing this. Dave Carney's had plenty of tweets where he said, hey, we're happy having this discussion. We'll do it. It's look, it's very easy to write a message that you're going to get 70-80% of people to say we shouldn't be teaching, second graders how to transition, whatever. Yeah, get it. We get it, but that's not the real environment that we're going to be in, and so that's why I'm a little bit more cautious about in terms of thinking that this necessarily is so obvious for them as an advantage, at least not as confident as they seem to be.
And I think Dave Carney and the Republicans right now, and with some degree of justification, are pretty confident though in their ability to drive those messages in a way and to drown out counter messages.
Yeah, I think so. Right. Well, and the thing is, the counter messages are not only going to be drowned out by the messaging that they're going to be placing, but also the messaging on all the bigger issues we've been talking about, like the economy, about the border. So this is secondary.
All right. Well, that was a good talk about education. And we'll be back. We were going to talk about a couple other things, but I think it makes sense to have aired that out a little bit because there's going to be a lot going on, and And it is, it is interesting from an inside perspective that that Team Abbott is testing, moving, the messaging on vouchers. Now, right now, I think, frankly, they want to talk about anything that's not abortion.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, still interesting. So we'll leave that as a teaser. A programming note, I'll be out of the loop for a few weeks. So the podcast will be on hiatus, but we'll be back probably the first week of June. Classes will be started again for summer. We'll have a podcast audience there. I should be back and hopefully decently rested. So thanks to Josh and to our excellent production team in the audio studio in the Liberal Arts Development Studio here at UT Austin. You can find all the data we referenced today and much, much more, including all these education results we talked about today and more, at the Texas Politics Project website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening and be well. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.